November 9th, 1967, Cape Kennedy, Florida. The first light of dawn spills across the Atlantic, washing over a gleaming white giant that towers against the pale horizon. Steam curls from its base as engineers in helmets and white shirts hunch over consoles inside the blockhouse. On Pad 39, stands a Saturn V, the most powerful rocket ever built by human hands. 5 colossal F-1 engines poised to awaken. In the control room, among hundreds of American specialists, a small cluster of men watches silently. Their faces are older now, marked by years of technical toil and quiet burden. They are German, veterans once of Peenemünde, engineers who designed another rocket more than 2 decades earlier. The V-2. As the final countdown echoes through loudspeakers, 9. Ignition sequence start, a low growl rises from beneath the pad. Flames burst outward in brilliant orange torrents. The ground shudders. One of the German engineers lowers his head, whispering almost to himself in disbelief. The thunder, the vibration, the light, it is all hauntingly familiar. But this time, the destination is not destruction. It is the moon. From that moment, history folded back upon itself, and the echoes of the V-2 had found their home in Saturn V. Long before the white giant of Saturn V ever trembled against the sky of Florida, another machine had been born in the windswept isolation of the Baltic coast. In 1936, as Europe simmered with political ambition and looming conflict, a remote German island named Peenemünde became the cradle of a new kind of warfare. Here, under the protection of the German Army Ordnance Office, a young engineer named Wernher von Braun was given a simple yet revolutionary mandate to make a rocket that could reach the edge of space and strike its target hundreds of miles away. It was the beginning of a scientific endeavor unlike any other of its time, one that fused the curiosity of exploration with the machinery of destruction. Peenemünde was not merely a laboratory. It was a city of engineers, machinists, and test stands, a self-contained universe of innovation. Within its sprawling hangars, precision instruments were crafted, guidance gyroscopes spun on test tables, and fuel injectors hissed under pressure. The Aggregate 4, soon to be known as the V-2, emerged as the first ballistic missile in human history. Standing 14 meters tall, weighing nearly 12 tons, it carried a warhead of nearly a ton of explosives and could reach speeds of over 5,000 kilometers per hour. Its engine burned a mixture of liquid oxygen and ethanol, driven by turbopumps powered by hydrogen peroxide. The design was decades ahead of its time, the first to break the barrier of spaceflight, if only for minutes. By 1942, after hundreds of failed tests, the first successful launch from Peenemünde tore through the clouds and vanished into the upper atmosphere. Witnesses described the scene as otherworldly, the ground shaking, the rocket's tail flaming like a meteor ascending to the heavens. Von Braun reportedly whispered that this was not a weapon, but the dawn of a new age. Yet war has its own gravity. What began as a scientific quest was soon captured by the iron will of the Nazi regime. The V-2 became a tool of vengeance, a Virgil Tungswaff, a weapon of retaliation to strike London, Antwerp, and Paris. Deep within underground tunnels at Mittelwerk, slave laborers under appalling conditions assembled thousands of these rockets. For every V-2 that rose into the sky, countless lives were extinguished below the earth. The engineers who once celebrated scientific triumph now walked among ghosts. Test flights continued, data was gathered, engines improved, guidance refined, but the moral stain deepened. By late 1944, the V-2 rained down upon Europe. Its flight was supersonic. Its arrival gave no warning. To those below, there was only a roar that arrived after the destruction. Yet even as the war turned against Germany, the engineers at Peenemünde continued their work with mechanical precision. They were driven not by ideology, but by obsession to perfect what they had begun. In the laboratories, experiments on nozzle shapes, turbopump efficiencies, and inertial control systems continued with an intensity that ignored the chaos consuming the Reich. Then came April 1945. The Red Army was closing in from the east, the Allies from the west. Peenemünde was evacuated. Von Braun and his senior staff made a fateful choice to surrender not to the Soviets, but to the Americans. In the forests of Bavaria, they buried documents, burned drawings, and loaded trucks with the remnants of their work. They were captured near Oberammergau by U.S. intelligence teams searching for technological spoils of war. What followed was an extraordinary transfer of brains and machinery. Under Operation Paperclip, more than 100 German scientists and engineers were secretly relocated to the United States. Peenemunde's test data, V-2 components, and even entire rockets were shipped across the Atlantic to a desert in New Mexico, White Sands Proving Ground. There, under the bright sun and endless sky, the first V-2s were reassembled and launched again, this time bearing American markings. To the men who once served at Peenemünde, it was a surreal resurrection. They stood in the desert, watching their creation rise again, this time not as a weapon of revenge, but as an instrument of science. The data from those flights would soon lay the foundation for the Redstone and Jupiter missiles, stepping stones towards space exploration. Yet beneath the progress lingered a haunting duality. The same equations that once guided terror were now aimed at the stars. From the ashes of a defeated empire, a new rocket age had begun. When the German engineers arrived in the United States, they entered a world utterly different from the one they had left behind. Gone were the secret compounds and the gray uniformed guards of Peenemünde. In their place stood open skies, military hangars, and American soldiers who viewed them with both curiosity and caution. Their new home was Fort Bliss, near El Paso, Texas, a dry and sunburnt landscape where the winds carried dust instead of salt. Here, under the careful supervision of the U.S. Army, Wernher von Braun and his team were instructed to rebuild what they knew best, the V-2. But now, their task was not to destroy cities, but to teach Americans how it worked, piece by piece. In the following years, the desert became their laboratory. At White Sands Proving Ground, the same rockets that had once terrorized Europe were launched for science. Each flight was meticulously tracked by radar and camera, each impact crater studied for data. American technicians learned the delicate art of handling cryogenic oxygen, mixing ethanol, and aligning gyroscopes, skills that only Peenemunde's veterans truly mastered. The Germans trained them patiently, blending broken English with the universal language of engineering. It was an uneasy alliance at first, a marriage of necessity. Yet in those vast, empty plains, the seeds of America's space program quietly took root. As the 1950s dawned, the geopolitical landscape changed again. The Cold War divided the world, and the United States found itself locked in a silent technological race with the Soviet Union. Rockets, once weapons of war, became symbols of prestige and power. Von Braun's team was moved from Fort Bliss to Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, where a new research center began to rise from the southern soil. They were now part of the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, ABMA, tasked with creating the next generation of missiles for America's defense. It was at Huntsville that the Peenemünde legacy evolved. The Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V-2, took shape under American funding and oversight. It retained familiar traits, a single-stage liquid fuel engine, turbopumps derived from wartime designs, and a guidance system echoing the old German principles. But it was larger, safer, and more reliable. Each launch brought lessons that would later scale into the monumental Saturn V. Engineers like Kurt D. Buss, Eberhard Ries, and Arthur Rudolph brought their Peenemünde experience into the modern industrial world of American mass production and rigorous testing. They learned to adapt to a new culture, one of documentation, peer review, and civilian oversight. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Soviets were racing ahead. In 1957, Sputnik 1 pierced the heavens, announcing to the world that the space race had begun. America was caught off guard. The Redstone team's expertise suddenly became invaluable. Within a year, von Braun's engineers launched Explorer 1, America's first satellite, atop a modified Jupiter C rocket. The balance of pride and urgency pushed Washington to consolidate its fragmented space efforts. On July 29, 1958, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was born. By 1960, the Redstone Group, with all its German and American engineers, was officially transferred into NASA's new Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. The mission was no longer military. It was human exploration. Under von Braun's leadership, the center began designing vehicles that could lift men beyond Earth's atmosphere. The progression was rapid, from Redstone to Jupiter to Saturn I, and finally the vision for Saturn V, a rocket taller than the Statue of Liberty, capable of sending astronauts to the moon. The philosophy that guided the project, however, still bore the fingerprints of Peenemünde. Testing was relentless. Every component was verified under fire. Static firings, full-scale mock-ups, redundant systems, all were principles refined in the V-2 days. But the spirit had changed. The engineers were older now, and their work was no longer shadowed by war. For many, the Saturn program was redemption, a chance to transform the science of destruction into the architecture of exploration. By the early 1960s, the world stood at the brink of a new era. The echoes of Peenemünde had traveled across continents and decades, finding a new home in the heart of America's most ambitious project. The lines of code, the fuel equations, the staging mathematics, all carried faint traces of a past that could never be erased. And as the countdown toward the moon began, the men who once worked in secrecy under the Reich now stood before television cameras, speaking the universal language of spaceflight. The old designs had not died. They had evolved. At the heart of this story lies not just a lineage of machines, but a transformation of minds. The V-2 and the Saturn V may have been separated by continents, ideologies, and decades, yet they were bound by a continuous thread of engineering thought. Each carried with it the fingerprints of the same people, men who had lived through the most destructive war in human history and who now sought meaning in exploration. Their journey reveals several angles, human, technical, and moral, that together define one of the most extraordinary transformations in the 20th century. The human angle is where the continuity begins. When the Peenemünde engineers first arrived in Huntsville, they were strangers in a nation still healing from war. Many Americans viewed them with suspicion, unsure how to reconcile the fact that former Nazi scientists were now being employed by the U.S. government. Yet within the engineering rooms, hierarchy dissolved into a single shared goal to solve problems that had never been solved before. The Germans brought with them an obsessive discipline for data and design documentation, habits forged in the precision culture of wartime research. They were methodical to the point of ritual. Each test recorded, each anomaly graphed, every failure dissected until it yielded understanding. American engineers, in contrast, were bold, improvisational, and often unafraid to challenge authority. Over time, these two cultures merged, creating a hybrid discipline, one that valued both German precision and American innovation. Huntsville became a living laboratory of collaboration, its workforce drawn from soldiers, scientists, and young graduates inspired by the idea of spaceflight. Leadership, too, evolved. Wernher von Braun was no longer the ambitious young prodigy of Peenemünde, but a public figure, photographed in suits rather than uniforms. His charisma, his ability to translate engineering into dreams, turned him into a bridge between the cold logic of science and the romantic vision of exploration. Inside NASA, his management style reflected lessons learned during the war: tight systems integration, centralized decision-making, and relentless testing. Yet now it was bound by democratic accountability, not military command. The shock for many of his former colleagues came not from technology, but from morality. For the first time, their work was illuminated by open press conferences, congressional hearings, and public scrutiny. The secrecy that once defined their careers was replaced by transparency, an adjustment that tested their pride, but also purified their purpose. The technical angle begins with propulsion, the lifeblood of any rocket. The V-2's engine was a pioneering piece of work, a 25-ton thrust liquid-fueled motor that burned ethanol and liquid oxygen, stabilized by a complex cooling system in which alcohol circulated through the chamber walls before combustion. It used turbo pumps driven by steam created from hydrogen peroxide and sodium permanganate, a brutal chemistry that demanded meticulous handling. When the same men began designing America's Redstone and later the Saturn V's F-1 engines, they carried the same lessons forward. The combustion instabilities, the flow oscillations, the cooling balance between temperature and pressure, these were problems they had already wrestled with 2 decades earlier. Yet the scale of Saturn V dwarfed anything they had known. Each F-1 produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust, 60 times more powerful than a single V-2 engine. The principles were familiar. The magnitude was staggering. Another technical inheritance lay in test philosophy. At Peenemünde, every rocket was tested to destruction before flight. That culture of empirical validation became a cornerstone of Huntsville's operations. Von Braun's motto, "Test what you fly what you test," became NASA doctrine. Static firings at Redstone and later at Marshall Space Flight Center replicated the roaring test stands of the Baltic coast, now refined with modern sensors, telemetry, and film analysis. Engineers trusted data more than theory, a mindset born from years of trial and failure under wartime pressure. The third major angle was guidance and control, the brain of the rocket. The V-2's guidance system relied on gyroscopes mounted in a stabilized platform, feeding signals to servomotors that moved graphite veins in the exhaust flow. It was crude by modern standards, but revolutionary for its time. The Saturn V inherited that same conceptual skeleton, but replaced it with extraordinary precision. The ST-124 inertial platform in the Saturn V's instrument unit was its direct descendant, now isolated on gimbals and stabilized by motors spinning at 40,000 revolutions per minute. Where the V-2 corrected its path by mechanical relays, the Saturn used digital computers that calculated trajectory in real time. Yet the logic was identical: measure deviation, apply correction, maintain stability. For the older engineers who had once wired gyros by hand, watching the Saturn V's guidance system align itself before launch was like witnessing the evolution of their own invention. Beyond the machinery lay a deeper moral angle. Many of the German engineers had lived through moral dissonance, pride in their scientific work entangled with shame over its purpose. In America, they found a second life, building rockets for peace, for discovery, for humanity's advancement. It gave their work a meaning that wartime propaganda never could. And yet, the shock lingered. They saw in the Saturn V the same anatomy they once designed for war: the turbopump assemblies, the cryogenic tanks, the guidance logic. It was as if history had reused their blueprints but changed the inscription at the top. From vengeance to voyage, from destruction to discovery. That realization, that a technology born in darkness could find purpose in light, became the most human angle of all. While propulsion and guidance formed the heart and brain of the Saturn V, its body, the colossal structure itself, revealed another deep echo from the V-2 era. The structural and staging philosophy that guided both machines was remarkably continuous, even as their scales defied comparison. The V-2 had been a single-stage missile built from a steel frame covered with thin aluminum panels, its tanks separated by domed bulkheads that doubled as load-bearing members. The Saturn V, by contrast, stood 110 meters tall, composed of 3 stages stacked like a vertical cathedral. Yet the underlying logic remained: lightweight tanks, strong longitudinal frames, and clean separation points. The Germans had pioneered the concept of tankage as structure, eliminating unnecessary frames to save weight. That same principle reappeared in Saturn's SIC and S2 stages, where liquid oxygen and kerosene were housed in massive aluminum tanks that bore the entire load of 5 F-1 engines beneath them. Even the test methods, vibration analysis, acoustic resonance mapping, structural proof loading, were descendants of Peenemünde practices now reborn with American precision instrumentation. Equally vital was the concept of staging, something von Braun had theorized since the 1930s but never realized under the Nazi regime. The V-2, bound by wartime constraints, could only be single-stage, but in technical papers circulated among Peenemünde engineers, multi-stage designs had already been explored in theory. The idea was simple yet revolutionary. Discard weight as you ascend, shedding empty tanks and engines so the remaining vehicle can climb higher. The Saturn V embodied this dream in full. When the first stage burned out at 38 miles altitude, explosive bolts fired and the entire lower section fell away in flames. To the engineers watching from the ground, it was as though the rocket was reborn midair, shaking off its steel skin to reveal another beneath. That moment, known as staging separation, had been a fantasy in 1944. By 1967, it was a perfected symphony of timing, engineering, and gravity's defeat. Beyond the structural echoes lay the invisible nervous system of both machines, telemetry, and data acquisition. At Peenemünde, data was recorded with primitive oscillographs and film reels, sensors feeding thin electrical traces across smoky paper drums. Every launch yielded a handful of usable plots, often delayed by hours or days. But the philosophy to measure everything, to let the data speak, was deeply embedded. In Huntsville, that same philosophy matured into one of the defining strengths of the American space program. The Saturn V's flights produced rivers of data, thousands of parameters transmitted in real time to Marshall, Houston, and the Cape. Engineers who once bent over black and white film now sat before glowing consoles, watching streams of telemetry scrolling across screens. They had crossed from the age of analog smoke to the dawn of the digital cosmos, but the instinct was the same: test, measure, understand. Another profound angle was systems integration, the orchestration of thousands of parts and disciplines into a single functioning whole. The V-2 project at Peenemünde had pioneered this concept without giving it a name. Aerodynamics, guidance, propulsion, and manufacturing were all coordinated under one roof. It was one of the first examples of true systems engineering in history. At Marshall Space Flight Center, von Braun institutionalized that philosophy, now backed by American resources and computing power. Engineers spoke of configuration control, interface documents, and failure trees, terms that would later define NASA's methodology. The shock among the older Germans was not that their ideas had survived, but that they had become standard practice across an entire nation. What was once improvised under pressure had now become codified science. Yet the deepest angle of all was moral and psychological. As the Saturn program advanced, many of the Peenemünde veterans found themselves wrestling with ghosts from their past. They watched the rocket's white hull gleam under the Florida sun and felt pride, but also unease. The shape, the proportions, the roar of ignition all stirred memories of darker times. In the control rooms, the sound of countdowns echoed the disciplined cadence of their old test sites. But now the voices were in English, and the purpose was exploration. Some of them spoke privately about the feeling of shock, not because of the technology itself, but because of what it represented. The same engineering that once delivered warheads to cities was now carrying human beings toward the moon. The continuity was both inspiring and haunting. For engineers like Arthur Rudolph, who had overseen production of V-2s at Middlework, the transformation was deeply personal. He would later direct the Saturn V's first stage development, a poetic inversion of his past. The V-2's assembly lines had run on slave labor and secrecy. The Saturns were built on open contracts and safety inspections. Yet controversy followed him long after the moon landings, a reminder that technology could not wash away history. For others, like von Braun, redemption came through vision, through the ability to convince a nation that space exploration was not a luxury, but destiny. He appeared on television, smiled before Congress, and spoke not of vengeance, but of humanity's place among the stars. By the late 1960s, the Saturn V stood as both a technological marvel and a moral mirror. To the veterans of Peenemünde, it was as if their youthful ambition had finally reached maturity, purged of its violent origins, reborn in the service of discovery. And yet, When the first launch thundered into the sky, the resemblance was unmistakable. The structure, the burn sequence, the oscillations of flight, all spoke the same engineering language. The difference was intent. Where once the rocket's shadow fell over cities in fear, now it traced an arc toward hope. The Saturn V was not just a machine of progress. It was a monument to transformation. Beneath its white paint and American flag, the ghosts of Peenemünde still whispered, reminders that even the most brilliant science must answer for the purpose it serves. November 9th, 1967, dawn broke over Cape Kennedy with a light that seemed almost ceremonial. The air shimmered with humidity, and the Atlantic winds carried a faint tang of salt over the sprawling launch complex. On the pad stood Saturn V SA-501, the vehicle for the unmanned Apollo 4 mission, the first full test of the rocket that would one day send humans to the moon. For most of the engineers gathered that morning, this was the culmination of nearly a decade of work. But for a smaller, quieter group, the aging veterans of Peenemünde, it was the culmination of a lifetime. Inside the blockhouse, tension coiled like a living thing. Consoles flickered, headsets crackled with clipped phrases, and the vast machinery of countdown procedures ticked toward zero. The scene had a ritualistic familiarity. For some of the older engineers, the smell of kerosene and the deep bass of turbopumps stirring to life brought back ghosts of the Baltic coast. Yet here the setting was bright, open, and filled with purpose. The insignia on their badges read NASA, not "Here's for Sucks Install," the Army Experimental Station. Still, as the final seconds approached, more than one pair of eyes among the German contingent turned misty. They had been here before, in another age, watching another rocket ignite. At 7 a.m., the ignition sequence began. First came the spark of the F-1 engines, then a gathering roar that built into an elemental fury. 5 colossal engines churned at once, consuming 3 tons of propellant per second. The ground vibrated with a violence that shook the human body to its core. Spectators miles away felt it in their chests. Inside the control center, indicators flashed green, thrust nominal, all engines go. The hold-down arms released. The Saturn V began to rise, slowly, almost hesitantly, as if testing its own power before surrendering to the sky. One of the German engineers, Hans Fichtner, who had once stood beside von Braun during early V-2 test firings, was seen wiping his eyes as the rocket cleared the tower. "It's the same heartbeat," he murmured. Those who understood him nodded in silence. For them, it was as though history itself had reawakened, not in defiance, but in vindication. The smoke, the flame, the trembling air, these were not memories of war anymore. They were symbols of transcendence. As the rocket climbed, engineers monitored its performance through endless streams of telemetry data. Each signal carried whispers of triumph and tension. The first stage, the SIC, burned for 2.5 minutes before detaching in a blaze of orange fire, falling into the Atlantic with the force of an earthquake. The second stage ignited perfectly. From the observation deck, the Saturn appeared as a streak of sunlight cutting through the morning haze, a white spear piercing the blue. For the veterans of Peenemünde, this was the moment when two worlds collided, the world of their youth and the one they now served. The engineering principles they had once applied under the pressure of war had now been purified by purpose. In the following hours, Apollo 4 performed flawlessly. It orbited the Earth twice, its third stage, SIVB, reigniting precisely on command, a maneuver once only dreamed of in theoretical notes passed around in 1943. Reentry tested the heat shield that would one day protect astronauts returning from the moon. The data exceeded expectations. Every system worked, every vibration stayed within tolerance. Every contingency was met with confidence. When the command module splashed down in the Pacific, cheers erupted in mission control. Reporters called it the most successful test flight in history. But for the men who had lived through the shadows of Peenemünde, success was a quieter emotion, a deep, almost spiritual exhale that words could not contain. In the aftermath, Wernher von Braun addressed his team in a brief internal meeting. Those who were there recalled his calm tone and uncharacteristic humility. "We have proven the machine," he said softly, "but more importantly, we have proven that we can change what it stands for." That sentiment hung in the air like a benediction. The same intellect that had once crafted weapons now shaped instruments of discovery. The same equations that had guided destruction were now guiding humanity toward the stars. The Apollo 4 mission marked the turning point not only for NASA's technical confidence, but also for the moral transformation of the men behind it. They had crossed an invisible line between past and future, from secrecy to openness, from coercion to collaboration, from war to wonder. For the first time in their careers, their work was not classified, not hidden, not feared. It was televised, celebrated, and embraced by millions. The thunder that once heralded destruction had become the music of progress. As the control room emptied that afternoon, the German engineers lingered by the viewing windows, watching the last plumes of vapor drift across the Cape. In their silence was a kind of disbelief that something so deeply entwined with their own past could be reborn so purely. The Saturn V stood tall in the distance, its base still steaming, its sides glinting in the sunlight. It was no longer a descendant of Peenemünde. It was a monument to what Peenemünde could have been had the world been wiser. The journey that began under the shadow of war had finally reached the light of day. But the true climax was yet to come, the moment when that same machine would carry human beings beyond Earth, fulfilling a dream older than any nation. Just over a year after Apollo 4's triumphant flight, the Saturn V prepared for its next great trial, one that would move beyond test data and into living history. On December 21st, 1968, a gray dawn settled over Cape Kennedy. The world was tense and weary. The Vietnam War raged, protests filled the streets, and the Cold War's shadow stretched across continents. Yet that morning, as 3 astronauts climbed into the command module of Apollo 8, the atmosphere held a kind of sacred calm. For the first time, human beings would ride atop the most powerful rocket ever built and leave Earth's orbit entirely. It was a gamble that could end in glory or catastrophe. Inside the firing room, hundreds of engineers sat motionless, each man's breath aligned with the slow rhythm of the countdown clock. Among them were several of the old Peenemünde veterans, older now, hair grayed, expressions hardened by decades of work. They watched the screens as telemetry streamed in perfect order. Every system checked, every valve responded. The F-1 engines of the first stage ignited with a blast that shattered the morning stillness. 5 suns erupted beneath the rocket, and the Saturn V began its majestic ascent. As it rose, the sound washed over the Florida coast like rolling thunder. In those first moments of liftoff, the emotional collision between past and present was overwhelming. To the outside world, this was a purely American achievement, red, white, and blue painted proudly on the hull. But inside the hearts of a few engineers, it was something deeper. They recognized the mathematics behind the guidance loops, the stress tolerances of the bulkheads, the sequence of stage separations, fingerprints of Peenemunde's legacy. They could see their old designs reborn in perfection, scaled to the heavens. One of them later remarked, "It was like watching your child grow into something you once only dreamed of." 2.5 minutes into flight, the first stage separated flawlessly. Seconds later, the S2 second stage ignited, its 5J, 2 engines glowing like blue stars. The rocket accelerated to over 15,000 miles per hour. At T plus 11 minutes, the third stage shut down, placing Apollo 8 into a temporary Earth orbit. For a few circuits around the planet, engineers checked every system, ensuring nothing had failed. Then came the command that would change everything: translunar injection. The third stage reignited, propelling the spacecraft out of Earth's gravitational cradle. Humanity was leaving home. As telemetry confirmed successful trajectory, silence filled the control room. There were no cheers, just the quiet recognition of magnitude. The same principles that had once delivered warheads to cities were now sending men toward the moon. It was both triumph and atonement compressed into a single moment. For the German engineers, the shock was indescribable. The V-2 had traveled barely 200 miles. Apollo 8 would travel 240,000. The gap was measured not in miles, but in morality. The same physics that had once defined vengeance now defined vision. When Apollo 8's crew, Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, read aloud from Genesis as they orbited the moon on Christmas Eve, millions of people on Earth listened in silence. In Huntsville, those who had built the Saturn V stood transfixed before television screens, faces lit by the faint blue glow. Some smiled, others wept. To hear human voices transmitted from the lunar orbit, something once confined to theoretical equations in Peenemünde notebooks, was a revelation beyond words. The transformation was complete. Technology once shackled to war had become humanity's bridge to the stars. Less than 7 months later, on July 16, 1969, that same transformation reached its apotheosis. The world awoke to the dawn of Apollo 11. Nearly 1 million spectators gathered along Florida's coastline. The humidity shimmered. Cameras clicked. Children perched on their father's shoulders as if witnessing the birth of a new world. The Saturn V, the final refinement of all that had come before, stood gleaming in the sunlight, its white body etched with the bold letters USA. At 9:32 a.m., ignition. Once again, the Earth shook. The plume extended for miles, and within seconds the rocket became a needle of light piercing the atmosphere. In the viewing stands, Wernher von Braun clasped his hands tightly. For years, he had fought to prove that rocketry could serve something greater than conflict. Now, as the vehicle climbed, he felt a kind of release. This was the culmination not of one man's work, but of generations of human striving. From the dusty wind tunnels of the 1930s to the horror of middle work, from the desolation of White Sands to the triumph of Huntsville. Everything had led to this moment. When Neil Armstrong set foot on the lunar surface days later, the world erupted in celebration. Yet amid the cheering and parades, the older engineers remained subdued. They knew what few others did, that the road to the moon had passed through the ruins of Europe. Every bolt, every valve, every line of code was written upon layers of history. For them, Apollo 11 was not only a victory for mankind, but also a reconciliation with the past. Their designs, once symbols of destruction, had carried the first humans to another world. The climax of this saga was not merely technical. It was moral, spiritual, almost mythic. The Peenemünde engineers had lived long enough to see their creation's true potential, to witness technology's capacity for redemption. As the final Saturn V launched into the blackness of space, they understood that their work would outlive them, detached from its origins, transformed by purpose. What began as the machinery of war had become the vessel of human unity. The echoes of the V-2 had not disappeared. They had evolved. The same pulse of combustion that once shook London now lifted mankind beyond the Earth. The same equations that once guided terror now guided exploration. And in that transformation lay the true turning point of the 20th century, proof that even in the aftermath of destruction, knowledge could be reborn in the service of wonder. When the smoke of the Apollo era began to clear, the world stood in awe of what had been achieved. Between 1967 and 1973, 13 Saturn V rockets had thundered into the sky, and not one had failed catastrophically. 12 men had walked on the moon, each step leaving a faint gray print that would outlast human memory. To the public, the story was simple. American innovation had triumphed. But within the engineering circles of Huntsville and Houston, there was a deeper understanding. The Saturn V was not the creation of a single generation or a single nation. It was the culmination of a lineage that began long before NASA existed. Its roots reached back to the dimly lit workshops of Peenemünde, where ideas were born under circumstances too dark to celebrate, yet too brilliant to deny. By the early 1970s, the old German engineers were fading into retirement. Their offices at Marshall Space Flight Center were being filled with younger Americans who had never known war, men and women raised in peace and possibility. To them, the Saturn V was an engineering marvel, a clean symbol of human progress. But for the veterans, it was something more complex, almost personal. They saw in its aluminum walls and guidance systems the culmination of dreams that had survived devastation, exile, and moral reckoning. They had lived to see their science redeemed, but they also knew that history's shadow would never entirely fade. The numbers told one part of the aftermath. Each Saturn V cost over $185 million to build, roughly equivalent to $1.5 billion in modern currency. It stood 363 feet tall, weighed 6.5 million pounds at launch, and could send 140,000 kilograms in a low Earth orbit. Its 5 F-1 engines in the first stage remained the most powerful single-chamber liquid fuel engines ever built. More than 400,000 people across 20,000 companies contributed to its construction. Every bolt, wire, and pipe had been tested, logged, and documented, a process that owed much to the rigorous engineering discipline introduced by von Braun's team decades earlier. In the months following Apollo 11, NASA's reputation soared to celestial heights. The United States had not only caught up with the Soviets, it had surpassed them. The moon landings symbolized more than victory in a geopolitical contest. They represented the triumph of reason, data, and cooperation over the chaos of conflict. The German engineers who had once lived under military secrecy now found their names in public commendations and television interviews. Huntsville, once a quiet southern town, became known as Rocket City, USA. Schools, streets, and parks bore names like Von Braun Drive, Rees Avenue, and D. Bus Street, memorials not to nationality, but to ingenuity. Yet amid the triumph, a quieter reality persisted. Many of those who had built the Saturn V knew that their crowning achievement marked the end of an era. The Apollo program, for all its grandeur, was unsustainable. The political winds shifted, funding evaporated, and the final Saturn V launch in 1973, carrying the Skylab space station, closed the chapter. Von Braun, once the face of American rocketry, left NASA the following year and soon after fell ill. He died in 1977, at the age of 65, leaving behind a complicated legacy, celebrated by some as the architect of the space age, condemned by others for his past under the Reich. Inside Marshall Space Flight Center, younger engineers carried forward fragments of the Saturn philosophy, systems integration, redundancy, and relentless testing. These principles became the DNA of modern aerospace projects. Even the space shuttle's main engines traced conceptual roots back to the early turbopump research of the 1940s. Across the decades, the same logic endured. Measure precisely, test exhaustively, learn from failure. But for the veterans of Peenemünde, no successor could match the emotional resonance of the Saturn V. To them, it was the final expression of everything they had learned, endured, and regretted. When they watched the last launch fade into the sky, many felt a quiet melancholy. Their life's work, once born in the shadows of war, had ended in a blaze of light. Humanity had stepped onto another world, and now the engines were silent. The aftermath of the Saturn V was not only technological, it was profoundly human. Those who had once built weapons for an empire now built monuments for mankind. Their past could not be erased, but it had been transformed, not by denial, but by purpose. And as the flames of the final launch faded into the heavens, so too did the last visible trace of Peenemunde's long, conflicted journey through history. As the 1970s unfolded, the world entered an age of reflection. The moon missions had ended, the launch pads grew silent, and the glory that once electrified the world gave way to nostalgia. Yet, beneath the surface of celebration, there emerged an unease, questions that history could no longer avoid. Who truly owned the legacy of the Saturn V? Could one separate its triumph from its origins? And what did it mean that the greatest symbol of peace in the space age had been born, in part, from the laboratories of war? In Europe, historians began to revisit the story of Peenemünde. For years, the achievements of von Braun's team have been celebrated almost mythically, portrayed as the story of visionary scientists trapped under a brutal regime. But as archives opened and witnesses spoke, darker truths surfaced. The V-2's production at Mittelwerk, where tens of thousands of forced laborers died under inhuman conditions, could no longer be ignored. The moral reckoning reached across the Atlantic, where some of the same engineers were now living comfortable lives in America. Investigations began to question the ethics of Operation Paperclip, the U.S. program that had brought these scientists to American soil. Critics argued that the pursuit of technology had allowed justice to be compromised, that the same men whose inventions once fueled terror had been rewarded with new homes and honors. For the engineers themselves, the scrutiny was painful, yet unavoidable. Arthur Rudolph, once hailed as a hero for directing the Saturn V's first stage, faced accusations related to his wartime management at Mittelwerk. In 1984, he chose to renounce his U.S. citizenship rather than stand trial, returning quietly to Germany. His departure cast a long shadow over the legacy of the Apollo engineers, reminding the world that no achievement, however noble, could completely erase the origins of its makers. Wernher von Braun, before his death, had often spoken publicly about the moral responsibility of scientists, acknowledging that science itself has no moral dimension, but the use of science does. For many, those words became a quiet epitaph for an entire generation of engineers who had seen both sides of human potential. Despite the controversy, the technological legacy of Peenemünde endured, reshaped, repurposed, and globalized. The systems engineering discipline they pioneered became a foundation for aerospace, computing, and modern industrial design. The detailed documentation methods, the all-up testing philosophy, the emphasis on iterative verification, all became standard practice. The same methods that once refined the V-2 and perfected the Saturn V were now being applied to everything from jetliners to microchips. The duality of this legacy, that brilliance and brutality could coexist within the same lineage, became a lesson written not in textbooks, but in conscience. By the 1980s, the Saturn V itself had become an artifact of history. Its towering remains stood in museums at Kennedy Space Center, Houston, and Huntsville, silent as cathedrals. Visitors stared upward in awe, oblivious to the ghosts embedded within its rivets and seams. For those who had lived through its making, standing beneath, it evoked a flood of contradictions, pride, grief, awe, and guilt. Some saw it as the culmination of human genius, others as proof that progress is never morally neutral. Beneath its flawless engineering lay a human story of ambition redeemed, but never cleansed. Over time, the myth of the Saturn V merged with the myth of humanity itself, that we are capable of creating miracles even from the ruins of our mistakes. The rocket became more than machinery, it became metaphor. To the world, it represented courage, discovery, and unity. But to history, it whispered a warning, that even our greatest triumphs carry the fingerprints of our past. When the last of the Peenemünde veterans passed away, they left behind more than blueprints. They left a paradox, proof that human ingenuity can transcend its origins, yet never escape them completely. The Saturn V remains their monument, standing not only for the conquest of space, but for the moral evolution of science itself. And so, the aftermath of this story is neither victory nor condemnation. It is remembrance, a recognition that the path from the V-2 to the Saturn V is the story of humankind's struggle to turn knowledge into wisdom. History has a way of folding back upon itself, of taking what was once born in darkness and reshaping it beneath the light. The story of the V-2 and the Saturn V is not just the tale of rockets and engineers. It is the story of humanity's most profound contradiction, our ability to create both devastation and discovery from the same spark of intelligence. What began as an instrument of fear ended as a symbol of hope, proving that even the most tainted knowledge can be reborn through purpose. When the Peenemünde engineers first sketched the contours of the V-2, they could not have imagined that those same equations would one day lift men beyond the Earth. The mathematics remained the same, only the intent changed. The line that once connected Berlin to London now reached from Cape Kennedy to the Sea of Tranquility. It is one of the great ironies of history that the same minds that once built the world's first weapon to touch space also built the first machine to carry humanity into it. Between those two arcs of flight, one ending in destruction, the other in transcendence, lies the entire moral evolution of the 20th century. The Saturn V stands today in silent halls, its vast body resting on steel cradles, its engines cold. Tourists gaze upward and see only triumph, the ultimate proof of what human beings can achieve when guided by vision. Yet, within its skin of riveted aluminum, it carries the invisible fingerprints of a generation that learned too late that power without conscience is only half an achievement. The rocket's greatness is not in its size or its power, but in what it symbolizes, that knowledge can survive its misuse, that humanity can rise above the ruins it creates. In the end, the shock of those Nazi engineers was not just in seeing their designs reborn under another flag, but in realizing that the purpose of their life's work had finally changed. Their rockets no longer screamed downward in vengeance. They soared upward in peace. The same flame that once illuminated war now lit the path to the moon. And in that transformation, history found its quiet redemption.